the OFCCP's revised scheduling letter, Practical Guidance on Analytical Strategy, presented by Dr. Jim Higgins of the Higgins Group, LLC. Your presenter today is Dr. Jim Higgins. I am Senior Managing Director of the Higgins Group. Our website is www.higginsgrp.com. A little bit about myself. I have a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology. I also have a doctorate in educational psychology, with my primary emphasis being on identifying sources of test bias, as well as developing and validating effective assessment procedures. In my professional background, I've taught applied statistics as an adjunct professor at California State University, Sacramento, and as a tenure track statistics professor at American River College in Sacramento. Overall, I have over 20 years of experience as a practitioner and consultant in the HR field. About the last 8 to 10 years have been pretty heavily weighted towards assisting federal contractors with analyzing their employee data to determine whether there is evidence of potential pay disparities that aren't explainable due to legitimate factors as they comply with the requirements of the OFCCP. One of my professional goals has always been to try to take statistics, which is often a bit intimidating to some people, and trying to put them in terms that can be understood by the practitioner who may not have gone to school to learn about statistical techniques. And so this webinar is really kind of a continuation of that particular goal of mine to explain statistical analysis as it relates to compensation analysis under the recently released OFCCP scheduling letter, item 19. Contact information, if you have any questions you'd like to ask me regarding this presentation, my office number there is 916-204-1749. Of course, you're welcome to visit my website, which has some more information about the kinds of compensation analyses and other services I provide, or you can feel free to email me at my email address as you see there on the screen. An overview of today's presentation is that briefly I'm going to discuss, and this is very briefly, item 19 of the OFCCP's scheduling letter. I'm going to talk about problems and promise because in my opinion there are some challenges posed by the recent scheduling letter, but there are also some significant advantages I think to contractors based on the methodology that the scheduling letter implies. We're going to take a look at multiple regression, what worked, what didn't, why the OFCCP's approach is actually superior, in my opinion, to the previous strategy, how to analyze compensation to address item 19, and then I want to give you a practical example. I'm going to walk you through how I analyze compensation when people have asked me about it. Now, one of the things this webinar is not about is it's not about the introduction to compensation analysis. We're not going to talk about what compensation analysis is. A lot of people, including myself, have given many presentations on that. It's not going to be so much about the basics of the regulations or the rules. It's going to be kind of hands-on how to analyze compensation. And so let's kind of come at it from that example. So let's take a look at item 19. Some of the high points of item 19 are that compensation data is to be reported at an individual level rather than at the more typically practiced group level. And the focus is going to be on total compensation. At least that's the ideal, I think, from the OFCCP's perspective. In practicality, arriving at a measure of total compensation for compliance purposes, isn't nearly as straightforward or easy as it sounds for many contractors. Your data need to include base salary and or wage rate and hours worked for all employees. It should the contractor should also submit other compensation measures such as bonuses, incentives, commissions, merit increases, and overtime for each employee. And the data should include hire date, individual race, ethnicity, job title, job group, and EEO1 category for each employee. So the implication really comes down to that notion that contractors are going to be required to analyze their data at the individual race ethnicity level. And so as a result, the analysis is going to be much more granular. It won't be based on aggregates such as whites versus minorities. A second implication is that the OFCCP will be able to run their own analytical screens of employer data to help flag problems and initiate audits. So how does this affect federal contractors? Well, as I said previously, there are some problems and some promises. Let's talk about the problems first. Well, first off, item 19 is going to allow the OFCCP to apply greater scrutiny and flag potential violations. Because of the fact they're going to have employee-level data, as I mentioned previously, they can run some analytical screens that will help them identify particular situations where there are flags of disparities that warrant attention. And it increases the complexity of the analysis for federal contractors, especially when one looks at individual pay components by individual ethnic groups. So not only are you having to look at compensation across multiple ethnic groups, but you're also going to have to do it for potentially multiple measures of compensation. So it's a lot more analysis in that respect. And it requires more effort to identify and address problems. And I say it requires more effort, but in a second I'm going to contradict myself, and you'll see what I mean there. But ultimately it comes down to you're looking at more variables across more groups, so one would assume that it's going to be more effort for federal contractors. So now let's look at the promises that the revised scheduling letter in item 19 seems to suggest. In my opinion, it actually simplifies the analysis in terms of identifying where the problem lies. Now that's where it may sound like a contradiction, because under the problems, I say it increases the complexity of the analysis. And it does in some ways. But notice the second bullet is, it allows contractors to more clearly identify the source of potential pay problems. I'll talk more about this in just a bit, but the real implication here is that now that we won't be looking at just whites versus minorities, but instead breaking minorities into individual ethnic groups, it's going to be much more easy to identify the specific group or groups which are impacted, and they won't be hidden in this larger group we would call all minorities. So as a result, it may reduce the effort required for a cohort analysis. Why? Because say you're looking at 5 different ethnic groups, and you can show that really the problem lies comparing Hispanics and whites. So whites are the favored group, Hispanics are a lesser paid group where there's evidence of a potential problem. Now, when you run your cohort analysis, it's going to be on a much smaller subset of employees rather than the overall agglomeration of all minorities. As a result, because you're able to get this greater level of granularity, my experience has shown me that you're actually going to end up with fewer jobs that are identified as having unexplainable problems that you need to dig into. And as a result, because when you run your analysis by individual ethnic group, and so when you find problems, it's more likely to be targeted at a smaller group that's from an individual ethnic group or maybe 2 ethnic groups, the actual liabilities that you're going to have to make, or the corrections to pay that you're going to have to make, are likely to be much smaller because you're not trying to average those across a larger group of minorities, but they're much more targeted to where there could be potential problems. Now I want to take a look at the past. You know, for the last several years, probably 5, 6 years, I, as well as many others, have gone around the country talking about multiple regression and trying to help federal contractors comply with the OFCCP's requirements that really you need to apply an analytical tool such as multiple regression to identify whether or not differences in pay by gender or minority status are perhaps explained by the data, or whether or not the differences are basically unexplainable and therefore evidence of discrimination. So multiple regression really is a very powerful statistical tool. And it's primarily used to model how one set of variables or a data set is related to and allows you to predict some dependent variable. So in our case, we're looking at, traditionally, we're looking at various employee characteristics and the relationship between those characteristics and pay, and we use those characteristics to develop a model of how the employer operates its compensation system. And then what we try to do using multiple regression is we say, once we control for these legitimate factors that drive pay, does gender or minority status actually add any additional predictive power? If so, then that means that after controlling for similarities in time and grade and performance and education, gender is still explaining some portion of why people receive the pay they have. Therefore, we would make the claim that gender is, in fact, a statistically significant predictor of compensation, which could potentially mean that the employer is discriminating against males or females, whatever the case may be. So that was the theory. That's how it's supposed to work. But the question I want to pose is, in terms of real-world, on-the-ground compensation analysis, how well does multiple regression really work? Well, in my opinion, not as well as one might hope. And here's why. Multiple regression is really kind of like a high-performance sports car, that if all the conditions are right, the roadway is smooth, the engine is tuned, it has the right fuel and the right driver, if all these things are in alignment, that sports car handles fabulously, and it's fast, and it's efficient, and everything just goes great. But in reality, as we look at our compensation analyses that we use with multiple regression, things aren't quite so great. And here's why. Multiple regression assumes certain things. In other words, in order for multiple regression to provide a valid analysis that can be applied with any kind of confidence, certain conditions need to be met. And so we call these the assumptions required for multiple regression. And here are the assumptions. The first assumption is that when you create your model to predict pay, all relevant variables are included. In other words, everything that legitimately should impact pay, you've included that in your model. Secondly, all irrelevant variables are excluded. So in other words, you don't have anything in your model that shouldn't be there. If it's not really contributing to predicting pay, it's not a statistically significant correlate to pay, you shouldn't include it in your model. The third assumption you think about is you have adequate sample size. And this gets back to kind of like the whole sports car analogy, is that multiple regression needs data that meets certain conditions in order to work appropriately. And one of those is that sample size. Now, you need a large enough group of people in your analysis in order for everything to work correctly mathematically. And so the OFCCP typically said that you need at least 30 people in your job group or your pay analysis group or your similarly situated employee group, whatever the case may be. And you had to have at least 5 people in the smallest of the 2 comparison groups. So you needed an adequate sample size. So kind of file that away for just a moment. There are other more technical assumptions that are really critical when one conducts a multiple regression analysis. I'm not going to go into any detail in them, but I'm going to mention them. One is an assumption of homoskedasticity. This is kind of a fancy statistical term that refers to the notion that when you have a predictor, like say time and grade, and you're using it to predict compensation, the ability for time and grade to accurately predict compensation should be roughly the same along all ranges of time and grade. And so in other words, if someone has 1 year in grade and someone has 15 years time and grade should be just as effective in both cases at coming up with an accurate prediction of compensation. So enough said about that, because this isn't really a statistical talk in that respect. Another assumption is that there's no extreme multicollinearity. What this refers to is that the factors that you include in your multiple regression model should not be really highly correlated with each other, because when you get that, you get this thing called multicollinearity, or in some cases, I'll just leave it at that, multicollinearity, and mathematically that causes your model to fall apart. And another assumption, finally, is that that the residuals in your model, which are kind of like the errors in your model, are normally distributed. I'm going to go into all that stuff, but just be aware that all the multiple regression analyses that we've been conducting across the industry has assumptions like these that if you don't pay attention to these assumptions, then you really can't have any confidence at all that your model has uncovered anything real. So now let's consider the following. And I ask those of you who are listening to this presentation, those who have analyzed pay or interpreted the results of compensation analyses, how often is the sample size questionable when we analyze a given job or pay analysis group? I would submit to you that based on the analyses I've done, almost always. Because except for in rare industries or rare job titles, the vast majority of the job titles that in a contractor's data set for the affirmative action plan, they just don't have that many people. Sure, there are exceptions where you have large numbers of employees, but more often than not, it's really very few. And so, as I mentioned previously, the OFCCP would say you have to have at least 30 people in your job group, at least 5 in the smallest comparison group. And what many of us have done in practicality or in order to address the real-world situation that we don't have that kind of sample size is we compromise. So I myself would say, well, as long as there's at least 20 people in the job group and at least 5 people in the smallest of the comparison groups, I'll run multiple regression on that. And so notice what I've done is I've kind of compromised. And so when I use a smaller sample size, it's important to realize that the smaller the sample size, the less accurate the results are going to be, and the more likelihood there is that what you find isn't going to reflect what we call truth with a capital T there. So that's one thing to consider. So right there, we know that typically, if we're going to apply multiple regression frequently, we don't meet the sample size requirements. Let me ask you this. How often do analysts make do with whatever variables are convenient or easily gathered? It's absolutely not uncommon in my past for me to actually tell contractors, because I know the practicalities of the real world. They'll say, well, what data should I submit? And my response is, well, for this first cut, what we really should do is just submit what's convenient, what you can get your hands on. But again, if you look back at the assumptions of multiple regression, which is all relevant variables are included and all irrelevant variables are excluded, that really leads to a violation of the tenets of multiple regression. How often do contractors wish they had data on variables that they know are critical but are simply not available? So an example of this would be, I've had instances where we know that previous pay is correlated with current pay. How do we know that? Because most often when an employer hires someone, they wonder, okay, what did the employee make previously? And, and then they use that as kind of a gauge to kind of, you want to give them some additional money so that they come, but you're not just going to give them an outrageous raise because, you want to. And another variable that's frequently desired is highly predictive is amount of relevant previous experience. You think about, these are the kinds of things that are on an application or things that you might discuss during an interview that absolutely impact your compensation setting decision. So, for example, if you know that someone has a very specific kind of experience that's very hard to get in a particular market segment, that person may be worth a significant premium. But if you don't have that information available, you just make do with what you have, which again, that violates the assumption that all relevant variables are included. And finally, how often do HR professionals or consultants really examine multicollinearity and homoscedasticity and normal distribution of residuals? I will tell you for a fact, almost never. Because we have these automated statistical tools that will generate things, and more often than not, that's technical stuff that just isn't normally in people's toolbox, and it greatly complicates the analysis to go in and try and deal with those when you're looking at multiple job titles And so as a result, many of these assumptions kind of go unquestioned. And so as a result, I think the analyses more often than not are highly questionable. And so what I want you to know is this. Multiple regression was never designed to show you what is not related to something. So in other words, multiple regression wasn't designed to show that gender is not related to pay. Instead, what it's designed to do is to model whatever, in this case compensation, in such a way that you can understand how your compensation process is working. You know, you can demonstrate statistically what goes into the decisions as to why people get the pay they get. And so it really wasn't designed to do what we use it to do. Here's something that even complicates it even more. And if you've done a lot of regression analyses, you've probably seen this yourself. Suppose you run a correlation between gender and pay, and you find that there's a statistically significant correlation. What that tells you is that gender seems to be related to whatever level of pay people are getting. So in a regression model, let's say you throw in time and grade, and then gender ceases being statistically significant. Well, then what you say is, well, once I've controlled for time and grade, gender is no longer statistically significant, so what appeared to be a difference in pay by gender is really just a function of the fact that males and females differ in terms of their time and grade. And then you throw in something like job performance, and suddenly gender is statistically significant again. And so you're like, well, what the heck? You know, it wasn't statistically significant before, but it is now. And then you throw in education, and then gender ceases being statistically significant again. And so what ends up happening is, depending on what variables you place in your model, gender will either be or will not be statistically significant. So as a result, it becomes possible to shape whether or not you find a statistically significant difference in, say, gender based on what variables you put in. Now, I don't think most people would do this consciously, but I myself have seen situations where I'm developing this model, and then I find, you know, okay, everything's working great, and then I add an additional variable, and suddenly gender turns into be statistically significant. And I will confess, and I think anybody who has done this along with me would, you know, should confess that I might have removed that variable. And it's a natural tendency of researchers to do that because you want to get the findings that you're looking for. And so that's one of the reasons that multiple regression, a valid multiple regression analysis, assumes that all relevant variables are included, because then you can have confidence that the model that you've developed is the absolute best that it can be. So having said that, you know, at least the blanket use of multiple regression as we've used it in the past, I don't think was really all that appropriate. Let's take a look at why the OFCCP's new scheduling letter actually may be better for contractors. Well, first off, the focus on specific ethnic groups clarifies exactly where real disparities are found. And that I talked about that a little bit earlier, that by breaking up that old minorities group into each of the ethnic groups, now suddenly you can compare a favored group, whoever is the highest paid group, with everyone else, and you can find that it may only be one particular group with statistically significant differences in pay from the highest paid group, and now you've really identified, here's what I have to address. When there are disparities, it will likely involve fewer employees. I think this is such an important point, because you may be looking at a job where you find a statistically significant difference between whites and minorities, but when you break that up, it may turn out that the real difference lies between whites and African Americans, and there are only 4 African Americans. So as a result, you're really only having to target these far fewer people to find out what the heck is going on. The statistical techniques used are, in my opinion, a lot more straightforward. And what I mean by that is they don't have all of those assumptions that multiple regression had. They still have assumptions, every statistical test does, but they're far fewer. And then finally, while the previous strategy seemed very scientific, And so contractors, consultants, and others may have patted themselves on the back if they've like, I've done this really complex analysis. Look how scientific it is. I have reams and reams of numbers. But really, all that analysis did not address what, at least in my experience, contractors complain the most about. And that is, after all is said and done, at the end of the day, it all comes down to a cohort analysis. Regardless of what the statistics say, someone ends up sifting through all the data to try to say, okay, well, is there a real reason why person A is paid less than person B? And unless we can address that problem with the cohort analysis, no matter how we analyze it, it's always going to be particularly challenging for contractors. So ultimately, as I say on my screen now, whatever analytical strategy a federal contractor uses, it all comes down to a cohort analysis where similarly qualified employees are compared in order to determine whether observed differences are legitimate, and if not, how and how much to adjust their pay. And from a resource perspective, this is where the pain lies for employers. So let's talk about how to analyze compensation under Item 19. So the requirement is to focus on the group level. Now for gender, nothing really changes because we already are only looking at two groups. The real change comes with ethnicity, because whereas before we had two groups to compare, now we have 5. Now, I've actually heard when the scheduling letter first came out, I heard some people immediately jump to some proposed solutions of how they would analyze pay, given looking at the individual ethnic groups. And so one of the knee-jerk responses I heard was that, well, we used t-tests before, so we'll just use t-tests or some other test to compare each ethnic group with every other ethnic group to identify any statistically significant differences that we could find. Now there's a second knee-jerk response, which is similar but better than the first one, and that is to immediately jump to using t-tests or some other two-group statistic to compare each of the lesser paid groups with the favored group or highest paid group in order to identify statistically significant differences. Now I want to say a warning that both of these approaches are absolutely incorrect. If you use either response 1 or response 2, the result will almost surely be inaccurate findings, at least in many cases. And let me explain why that's the case. In statistics, there's a term called alpha inflation. And the alpha inflation, basically every time you conduct a statistical test, it never proves, you're never absolutely 100% confident that you have uncovered the truth. You only have an idea of how confident you can be. There's always still a chance you're wrong. So in other words, when you compare two groups like males and females in terms of their pay, and when you find a statistically significant difference, it doesn't mean that you have guaranteed 100% proven that a difference exists. When it comes to statistics, all you can say, generally speaking, I'm simplifying this here, is that there's a 5% chance that the difference is actually a fluke. In other words, if you find a statistically significant difference, you can say you're about 95% confident that the difference exists, but there's about a 5% chance that this is just sort of a random fluke event. There's no meaningful discrimination taking place here. So the problem is, if there's a 5% chance when you compare two groups, if you make multiple comparisons with the same data, so for example, whites versus blacks, whites versus Hispanics, whites versus Asians, you no longer have just one comparison of two groups. Instead, you have 4 separate comparisons, okay? So what actually happens is that 5% chance of error compounds each time you make an additional comparison. So for example, the first time you make a comparison, when you have only one pair, statisticians would say you have an error rate of 5%, or there's a 5% chance that what you found, was really not a real difference. When you add the second pair, that's another 5%. So now you have a 10% chance of getting a statistically significant result purely by random chance. 3 pairs, well, now you're adding another 5%. 4 pairs, now you're adding another 5%. So when you have 4 comparisons using the same data, you're essentially saying that you're increasing the risk that you're going to find a difference purely by chance. And you magnify that across all of your job titles as you run this analysis across all groups. Your likelihood of finding a whole bunch of spurious statistically significant differences goes up dramatically. And there are some other concerns that we need to be aware of before we decide on what statistical technique we want to use when we run our analysis. So one, as we mentioned previously, is sample size. So whatever approach we use, it has to be something that's more amenable to small samples than tools like multiple regression. We need to take into account the assumptions associated with a selected statistical test. So as I mentioned previously, multiple regression has a wide array of assumptions that really need to be met in order to have confidence in the analysis. So what we need to do is find a statistical test or statistical tests that are more robust, fewer assumptions, and so you don't have to worry so much about them. They'll work on a whole bunch of ranges of data. Statistical power is another issue we need to be aware of. Statistical power essentially refers to the ability of your analysis to identify real differences that exist. Robustness or flexibility, this is in many ways related to the assumptions mentioned above. You need a test that can take a beating and keep on ticking. You know, you can use it in a variety of circumstances, wide variety of sample sizes, normal distributions, non-normal distributions, something that will run on pretty much any data that you have. So in my mind, the appropriate strategy for analyzing compensation, and I'm going to talk about ethnic groups here, kind of follows the following general format. Step one is you need to find a statistic that allows you to compare all ethnic groups in one giant comparison in a way that will avoid alpha inflation. So the analysis can't do group A to group B, group A to group C, group A to group D, that kind of thing. Instead, it has to be able to do a single joint analysis that doesn't have multiple analyses in that same thing, so that you can avoid alpha inflation. If you find a statistically significant difference in step one, whatever test we use to do that, the next step is to identify the favored group. So it's like, all right, we found there's a statistically significant difference by ethnicity in this job title. Now what we need to do is find out, okay, who's the highest paid group? And then we want to actually run a two-group statistical test comparing that favored group with each of the lesser paid groups. And so you might say, well, wait a minute, isn't that like going back and doing a bunch of t-tests where you compare the favored group with all the other groups? Kind of. Because remember, before we ever did this, two-group comparison, we've already established that somewhere among these groups there's a statistical difference, and we found that in step one. So in other words, are we still going to get a little bit of alpha inflation? Yeah, but at least we have confidence that somewhere in here there is in fact a real difference. So we identify our favored group, and we then compare the lesser paid groups to the favored groups. It isn't going to be in every case that we're able to do a statistical test if the sample size is too small. So, but if the sample size is large enough, we go ahead and we do this two-group comparison, comparing the favored group and the lesser paid groups. And then ultimately, even if you find a statistically significant difference, or if you don't, if you find a statistically significant difference, it's important to then not just say, oh, I found a statistically significant difference, I have a problem. Now you're going to have to take a step back and do what I call, see if the difference passes the Snell test. What do I mean by that? Essentially, because of the fact that we're breaking all this data down into smaller groups, individual ethnic groups, we're likely to be dealing with pretty small sample sizes. Now, when you have small sample sizes, the chance of finding a statistically significant difference purely by chance, just because the data is kind of fluky, also goes up. So, for example, you can stick data into a statistical package like SPSS, and it might tell you that there's a statistically significant difference between 3 whites and 1 African American. And it'll say, see, you got a statistically significant difference. But the reality is, when you're dealing with numbers that small, you can't have any confidence at all in that statistic. You know, you can't hang your hat on it. Let me say it that way. So as a result, even when you find a statistically significant difference, you're going to have to kind of check it out and weigh it in light of the other evidence, as I'll show you in just a little bit. Then, after you've done your statistical analysis, you compare these groups, you're still going to have to go back and do a cohort analysis focusing primarily, but with exceptions, on those groups where you have uncovered statistically significant differences that can't be explained by other statistics, or if you couldn't run a statistical test because the sample size was too small, you're still going to have to go in and kind of figure that out. And then you adjust pay as necessary. Now, in case I forget to do it later, I'm going to bring this up now. In the past strategy, when we relied heavily on t-tests and multiple regression, we would, you know, many of us would make kind of a big deal about calculating liabilities for employers, like how much do you need to adjust the pay of each of these people in order to eliminate statistical significance. And there was nothing wrong with that, and actually it's the appropriate thing to do. But as I've already mentioned, you know, in most cases, our multiple regression models really weren't that acceptable for making these kinds of predictions. So as a result, while we have the veneer of science and statistics, I would argue that by and large, many of those numbers weren't particularly accurate. And I'm also of the opinion that even though people like me would give employers these analyses that would say you need to adjust these people's pay by X amount, it was rare that the employer actually did that. Instead, they went back and did a cohort analysis, and then they made more of a subjective decision about what the employee should be paid. So I think especially when we're talking about ethnicity and we're breaking people into these multiple ethnic groups and the sample size is small, the process of identifying pay adjustments is going to be much more subjective. It really is going to come down to a cohort analysis. So step one, if we're looking at ethnic groups, does a difference exist among these 5 ethnic groups? So this is right now we're at the process where we're trying to determine, for this job title, is there a statistically significant difference by ethnic group? Well, there are a variety of statistical tests that are designed to compare more than 2 groups. So the way we used multiple regression before and t-tests, it really required 2 groups, males, females, whites, all minorities. Those tests are not designed to handle more than 2 groups. Well, it turns out that in the array of statistical tests that are available, there are in fact statistics that are designed to do exactly what we want to do. We want to compare 5 ethnic groups to determine, is there a statistically significant difference somewhere among these ethnic groups? And one of those tests is called a one-way analysis of variance, or it's often called ANOVA by statistical professionals. Another test is called a Kruskal-Wallis non-parametric equivalent of a one-way analysis of variance. This is very much like an analysis of variance, but it's calculated totally different, and you'll see the differences. So why, what makes the difference between these 2 tests in a moment. Yet another test is a median test, K-samples pooled medians. This is a test where you're comparing medians of different groups, and the K simply refers to the number of groups that you have. So really it's a median test, 5 samples, pooled medians. These tests are specifically designed to identify differences among 2 or more groups without increasing alpha error. So these are the tools for the job when it comes to ethnicity. So what test should you use? ANOVA or Kruskal-Wallis and or the median test? Well, let's take a look at this analysis of variance statistic, which, by the way, is a very powerful, very great statistic. I love analysis of variance. It has a lot of advantages to it but it does have some disadvantages. So as I mentioned previously, ANOVA is specifically designed to compare two or more groups. It's also what is called a parametric statistical test. Now, I'm not going to get into the background of this, but let me just say it like this. ANOVA requires that you calculate an average and a standard deviation. So it relies on averages and standard deviations in order to calculate the thing. It's important to know that when you're dealing with small sample sizes, averages and standard deviations fall apart, right? Because one person who is a little bit more or a little bit less than the group completely throws off the average. It causes what we call skewness. And since the standard deviation relies on the average when it's calculated, if the average is wrong, the standard deviation is wrong. And so ultimately, if you're dealing with small sample sizes as we're doing, that's a challenge for analysis of variance. And the way analysis of variance works is it works by partitioning the total variance between all the groups, or the total variance among the groups. It breaks it down into two components. The variation within groups, which means how much variability is there within each ethnic group, and the variability between groups, how much variability there is between various groups. And it uses a process where in the end, it determines whether or not the amount of the ratio of the variability between groups to within groups is so big that you can say somewhere in here there's a statistically significant difference. That's enough of that. It's powerful. If you have an appropriate sample size, this is a really, really good test. It includes precise post hoc tests. So most statistical procedures, programs like SPSS and SAS and others, if you run an analysis of variance and you find a statistically significant difference that's somewhere among your groups, it has these follow-up tests, which are called post hoc or after-the-fact tests, that help you to identify exactly where those differences lie. And so that's a really great feature of analysis of variance. However, it has some more explicit data assumptions. As I mentioned, it relies on the average and standard deviation, which means, basically you're assuming a normal distribution, your data is interval or ratio level, all these kinds of things like that I won't get into. Suffice it to say, it requires some pretty specific fuel in order to run correctly. And because it relies on the average and standard deviation, it's affected greatly by small sample sizes. So to me, that sounds like, given all that, the fact that most of our data if we're looking at the job title level is going to be smaller sample sizes, ANOVA is probably not applicable. If you happen to have a job title with a large sample size and you want to pull that baby out, then by all means. So now let's look at the Kruskal-Wallis and the median test. These two tests were specifically designed to compare two or more groups, just like ANOVA. But these are what are called non-parametric statistical tests. In other words, they don't rely on the mean or the standard deviation to get their results. Instead, they're based around ranking these different groups. Like you rank each of the groups. You take every employee and you place them in a ranking based on their salary. And when you do that, there's a formula that you can use that would tell you whether or not one or more of these groups is so different from the others that it must be statistically significant. So it's a totally different statistical test that's designed to do the same kinds of things as ANOVA, but without the limitation of being a parametric test. It's less powerful. That's one of the downsides. So because it doesn't rely on the mean and standard deviation for a variety of reasons, these tests aren't quite as adept at finding differences as we would like, but it's kind of one of the trade-offs that you get. Now, post hoc tests. So let's say you do a Kruskal-Wallis and or a median test, and you find that somewhere among the ethnic groups in this particular job title there's a statistically significant difference. There are really no set-aside, specifically designed post hoc tests that I use or that are easily available to me. There are some, but they're not as easily available to follow up and say, all right, where is the difference? And so we'll talk about that in just a moment. Fewer assumptions on your data. As long as you have at least ordinal data where you can place people in order, These are generally what are called distribution-free statistics, so they don't rely on assumptions of the normal distribution, and they're less affected by small sample sizes. But it's important to remember that ultimately every statistical test is affected by small sample sizes. So in my opinion, given the big picture, looking at the data that contractors typically use and the fact that usually the bulk of their data, if they're analyzing it by job title, is just, they're just going to be smaller numbers, I think that it's the safest bet to use the Kruskal-Wallis and or the median test. And as I'll show you later, I actually use both. Because again, since we're dealing with small sample sizes, it's sort of and maybe some statisticians would say I'm being kind of goofy about this, but because the median test and the Kruskal-Wallis test are computed in different ways, by using both of them, if I find a statistically significant difference with either of them, then I say, all right, I have found a statistically significant difference. So let's assume that you found a statistically significant difference with the Kruskal-Wallis or ANOVA. Then what do? Well, if you're using ANOVA, as I mentioned previously, you'll use these things called post hoc tests. And I listed 3 of the post hoc tests here that I'm really not going to go into. You'll see on my screen kind of some things I talk about. I will just mention that these post hoc tests, what they allow you to do is make statistical comparisons, and you can actually adjust how much alpha inflation you're willing to accept, or alpha risk you're willing to accept. And so these are more or from the least conservative to the most conservative. I usually choose this thing called Tukey's honestly significant difference when I run ANOVA, because it's not too conservative, it's not super non-conservative. It's kind of like the Goldilocks scenario where it's not too cold, it's not too hot, it's just right. And so Tukey's honestly significant difference post hoc test is, I think, a good middle of the road test to use if you're running analysis variance. But if you're running a Kruskal-Wallis or a median test, for me, all I do for post hoc tests is I then turn around and I run what's called a Mann-Whitney-U test and a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. These are kind of like t-tests, and as a matter of fact, they're non-parametric equivalents of an independent samples t-test. And so, just like with the Kruskal-Wallis, these don't rely on the median or on the mean and the standard deviation. So really, you have a number of choices. If you find a statistically significant difference by ethnicity, you could run a Mann-Whitney-U test, a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. You could do a signed rank test. And what you're doing is you're going to be comparing the favored group with each of the lesser paid groups. And you may still run the risk of some alpha inflation and finding a difference that doesn't really exist, but at least you're only doing it when you know that somewhere in this group there's a statistically significant difference. So if you find a statistically significant difference in the ethnic group, then what? Well, if your sample size, I'm going to step back. So we ran our Kruskal-Wallis and we found a statistically significant difference in job A by ethnicity. Then we ran the Mann-Whitney-U and we found that there was a statistically significant difference between whites, who were the favored group, and African Americans, who were the lesser paid group. And if the sample size is large enough for whites and African Americans, then I would follow up with a multiple regression analysis that targets just those two groups. And I only do that when the sample size will support it. And what I mean by that is I fall back on the OFCCP's original sample size sort of requirement / suggestion, which is if you have at least 30 people total between the favored group and whatever impacted group you're analyzing, and you have at least 5 people in the smallest of those two groups, then I would go ahead and run a multiple regression. But remember, the larger the sample size, the better. And after you've run your multiple regression analysis, just like in the past, if the gender or ethnic variable is still significant after a regression analysis, you follow up with a cohort analysis. Now, if you found a statistically significant difference, say, between whites and African Americans, but the sample size is too small for multiple regression, well, then you're just going to have to follow up with a cohort analysis, which you're probably going to have to do anyway. Now let's take a look at gender. Now with gender, because nothing's really changed between, since we're still looking at two groups just like we were before, you could just go ahead and run independent samples t-tests just like before. But remember, some of those same limitations with multiple regression also apply to t-tests. T-tests, if you ever look at the formula for calculating a t-test, it requires calculations of the average for both groups, the standard deviation for both groups, the variance, all these kinds of things. And so when you're dealing with small sample sizes, averages and standard deviations are usually pretty bogus. And so with small sample sizes, even though I'm going to confess in the past, because that's kind of what we were understood we were supposed to do, I ran t-tests on groups as small as 6, as long as there were at least 3 people in the smallest of the 2 groups. And that's really not appropriate. I'm just going to have to say it right out there because the sample size is just too small. So let me get back here to what I'm supposed to be talking about. So we're comparing 2 groups, gender. Well, as I mentioned, just like what I was talking about with the ethnic group study, when you're only comparing 2 groups, one possibility is to use this test called the Mann-Whitney U. It's a non-parametric equivalent of an independent samples t-test, but because it's non-parametric, it relies on ranks rather than averages and standard deviations. You can look at the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, and that is also a non-parametric version of an independent samples t-test. The signed ranks test, same thing, designed to compare 2 groups. And then, of course, the old standby independent samples t-test. Now, you'll notice that I have the Mann-Whitney, the Kolmogorov-Smirnov, and the signed ranks test in green because those are all non-parametric tests, and they're distribution-free, meaning that they're not impacted by skewness and stuff like that. So they're really much more appropriate for use if you want to get right down to it when we're dealing with small sample sizes. Now, my company ran, for one client, when I was first putting all this methodology together, I actually ran a comparison of looking at the Mann-Whitney U, the Kolmogorov-Smirnov, and independent samples t-tests on the same data to determine whether or not all the tests kind of generally uncovered the same statistically significant findings. And what I found was, yes, by and large, they did uncover the same problem areas. So power didn't seem to be a problem, but there were some differences. And when I dug a little bit deeper and looked at where the independent samples t-test differed from the non-parametric tests, when I looked at the various statistics that are generated by the statistical package I used, there was a lot of funky stuff in there that was clearly caused by the fact that we had small sample sizes. So to me, I just think you can have a lot more confidence if you're looking at small sample sizes using the non-parametric test. If you have large enough sample sizes, by all means, the independent samples t-test is more powerful and more appropriate. So what does an analysis look like? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through, I call it the Higgins Group method, because I saw the OFCCP's recent scheduling letter as an opportunity to rethink how I run compensation analyses, keeping in mind the kinds of problems that my clients have faced when they try to make sense of it all. And so my goal has been to try and focus on making it easy to interpret the results. So as you're going to see in a moment, I rely really heavily on color coding and providing various bits of information that you can instantly jump to and kind of identify where problems are. Now my method is kind of evolving, but as I walk through it, I'm hoping you'll agree with me that there really are some things, and I encourage you to try to copy the approach of what I've got here. So my approach is basically to analyze, summarize, visualize. What I mean by that is I get my data and I analyze it, I summarize it using a pivot table, and then visualizing has to do with color coding all the problems I can find, things that I want the client to look for. I use built-in logic to make some comparisons that take into account things like the size of the difference between groups, the pattern of explanatory factors, as you'll see in a moment, the number of explanatory factors that seem to be problematic, whether or not there's statistically significant differences. I try to use this logic to then come up with a common sense analysis to really highlight where I think the problems are. And then I generate a cohort analysis support report that will help the client really kind of get down and do something that I think is perhaps the biggest challenge of all, which is the cohort analysis. So step one in my analytical technique is to gather the data. Now, the OFCCP, they want total compensation, and so you'll see the first variable under compensation measures is total compensation. Well, like I say, that's not possible at this point for everybody because, I work some companies that, they have tons of pay codes and trying to extract it out in a reliable way across the entire company for this type of analysis is just very, very difficult and time-consuming. But nevertheless, if you have it, that's one measure. Annual rate, annualized compensation, overtime, bonus, incentive, stock, dollar value of stock awarded during the year. All these are individual measures that make up total compensation, right? Because your annual rate plus your overtime plus your bonus plus your stock plus, performance sharing plan, all these kind of things, they can go into total compensation. So when I run an analysis, I allow a client to provide me with up to 10 separate measures of pay. And I actually run my analysis on all 10 measures, or as many measures as they give me, because it's kind of like a step analysis. If there's a disparity in pay among overtime, but not among total compensation, well, still there's an issue there. And so what I try to do is run my analysis in a way to help uncover problems among any of these measures of compensation that I've provided. The second thing you need to get together is your compensation drivers or explanatory factors. You'll see that I go back and forth about these terms. And so these are your traditional things like time and job, time and grade, years of service, degree, performance, et cetera, et cetera. So you get all this data together. The next step is to select your unit of analysis. So your unit of analysis is really what is the level that you're going to analyze this in. And typically it's based on the employer's judgment based on a thorough knowledge of their compensation system, which takes us to, are you going to analyze your data by job title, pay analysis group, pay grade, some other way of creating similarly situated employee groups? However you do it, it's ultimately up to the employer. My own opinion is typically I think the job title is the most appropriate level of analysis because it's hard to argue that there's anything more similarly situated than people who are doing the same work under the same circumstances, same minimum qualifications, same level of supervision, et cetera. But however you do it, ultimately it's just important to keep this in mind. The OFCCP is interested in determining whether similarly qualified employees who are performing highly similar work are being paid equitably. So, like I say, whatever units of analysis you use, keep that point in mind. Step 3 is identify high-impact drivers of pay. Now, in multiple regression, what we did is the statistical test itself calculated the impact that each individual explanatory variable had on pay. So it's like the unique variance explained by that variable was calculated out. But we're not doing multiple regression here for the reasons described previously. But still, we know that not every measure or not every explanatory factor, time and grade, education, years of experience, not all of those have the same impact on pay. So my approach is to identify what I call high-impact drivers. So this is like picking from among the various variables that you're using to kind of explain pay, which are those that you want to say, these are the big ticket ones. These are the ones that we believe have the most significant impact on pay. And I think there are two ways to accomplish the identification of these high-impact drivers. One is, again, relying on the employer's judgment based on a thorough knowledge of their compensation system. I've worked with companies who say, we know that time and grade and years of service and job performance, those are the ones we want to focus on. And that's perfectly acceptable. Another approach, though, is to do it based on an empirically based method where the analysis is based around correlation coefficients. So you run a correlation coefficient between each pay driver and each measure of compensation. So here's an example. Across the top, you see total compensation, annual rate, incentive bonus, and dollar amount of stock. And along the left, you see the various pay drivers that I've identified: time and grade, time and job, service years, highest degree, job performance, and years experience. And the numbers in that table are the correlations between each of those variables and each measure of pay. So time and grade has a correlation coefficient of 0.30 with total comp, 0.35 with annual rate, and it has a much lower correlation with incentive and bonus, as I would say is expected, because you don't get your incentive or your stock based on your time and grade. Instead, that's going to be more generated around performance, which you notice job performance is correlated with total comp, incentive bonus, and dollar value of stock, as one would expect. So what you could do as an employer or as an analyst is you could say, here are my variables. I'm going to set kind of a threshold, or I'm going to pick, based on my correlation coefficient, which of these are going to be the variables that I'm going to give extra credit for when I'm trying to identify problems in differences between pay. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. So step 4 is to generate a summary report. Now what I do is I create a special pivot table that arrays the data. And this pivot table is generated from a proprietary system I built specifically for this purpose that tries to array the data in a way that really maximizes interpretability. In order to do that, one of the things I do is I identify the favored group. So if I'm looking at ethnicity, I identify which of those 5 ethnic groups is the favored group, meaning they receive the most pay. And then for each of the lesser paid groups, I calculate the percent difference between the favored group and themselves. And then I take a look at the various pay drivers or explanatory factors, and I compare the pattern of those drivers for each of the lesser paid groups to the favored group. Ideally, the favored group should have more of all or most of those explanatory factors than the lesser paid groups. That's the ideal situation, is that the favored group has more time and grade, more time in company, higher performance, higher education. And so then I take that into account, and I color code these differences to help you identify where there are potential issues. Then I assess statistical significance, so I run all the various statistical tests I talked about between, first off, to find out, is there a statistically significant difference at all, and if so, where it is. And then, based on the size of the difference between groups, the pattern of the pay drivers or explanatory factors, and whether or not there's statistical significance, I generate what I call a cohort warning that is designed to help the analyst or the company identify which particular job titles really warrant a much deeper dive to find out what's going on. So here's an example of the summary report that my system generates. I call the system ISAC, for Intelligent System for Analyzing Contractor Compensation. And so as you take a look at this table, the first thing I want you to see is notice that there are reds, greens, and yellows. Now there are some shades of red that aren't quite as red as you might think, but still the same kind of pattern holds true. Reds, greens, yellows, and there's a little bit of blue. Once you understand what these colors mean, then it makes a lot of the rest of this interpretation for your entire data set really quite easy. So let me break down this report for you. The first thing I do is I identify the favored group. Now I'm using gender here because it easily fits on the screen, and so I could zoom in so you could actually see it. So in this case, males are the favored group. So just at a glance, you see this blue favored, and you know you're looking at the group that's the highest paid. Next, I look at every other group, in this case females, and I identify them, and then I also calculate the percentage difference from the favored group. And so in this case, females earn about 8.01% less than the favored group, which is male. And notice that females are color-coded yellow. Now I have a logic that's built into my system that if the difference between groups, in this case males and females, is between 2 and 10%, it's color-coded yellow. If it's greater than 10%, it's color-coded red. Okay? So again, at a glance, you can identify the favored versus the lesser paid group and the difference between them. I also see under the factors column, in column B, you can see I highlight the various, or you can see are listed rather, the various measures of pay I'm analyzing. And under that are the pay drivers or explanatory factors. Okay, now let's take a look at the explanatory factors, average of time and grade, average service years, average previous experience, things like that. Notice that they're color-coded. So under female, you see reds, greens, and yellows. And basically, whenever you see red anywhere on my reports, red is bad. Red means a significant warning. Now, for the pay factors, when you see red, what you see, the red means that the lower paid group is actually higher or has more of this factor than the favored group. And if it's red, it means it's a high impact factor. So remember, we identified early on that certain factors are like high dollar factors. These are the things that really impact pay. And one of those we identified was time and grade. So what happens is, in my analysis, is that if the lesser paid group has more of a high impact factor than the favored group, it gets color-coded as red. And so it's saying, like, warning, this is a really significant thing. So in this case, not only do females have more time and grade than males, they have 6.2 years to 1.0 year. But this is one of those factors that you really need to pay attention to if the lesser paid group has more of it. You'll also see that there's some yellow. Yellow still means that the lower paid group has more of this particular factor than the favored group, but it's not one of those really, really significant high impact pay drivers. So as a result, it's important to note that the lower paid group has more of it, but you may not want to give it quite as much weight as you would a high impact factor. And then finally, you'll see that there's green. And so green is typically good. If you see green in this case, it means that the lesser paid group either has the same as or less on that particular pay driver or explanatory factor than the favored group. So what you want to see is a bunch of green in that column. You're rarely going to see all green, but it happens. But what you definitely don't want to see is a bunch of red. And so what you can see, again, at a glance, without even looking at the numbers, if you look at the female column and you look down and you see reds and yellows, right away you know, wow, there may be something going on here. Okay. Now look over here in column G under problem factors. Now what problem factors are is it's kind of a way of summarizing what's going on in the pay factors we looked at in the previous slide. And so essentially what the problem factors does is it identifies the favored group, in this case it's male. If we were looking at ethnic group, it would be whichever group was the highest paid. And then it calculates how many of the explanatory factors did the lesser paid group have that was more than the higher paid group. So in this case, females had a total of 3 explanatory factors that were greater than the favored group. So again, this is another one of those, like, a quick thing you could look at. What you want to see is 0 there that says basically females didn't have any factors. You know, they were lesser paid, but they didn't have any factors that didn't support the fact that they were lesser paid. The larger that number, the greater the problem. The next thing I do is I actually run a statistical analysis such as those I discussed previously. And while all the stuff that I've shown you to date, I run using my Isaac computer program, I've decided that I'm not going to rely any longer on canned statistical analyses to analyze compensation, because of the fact that the specific statistical test you use really is a function of your sample size and the data that you have available and things like that. So I actually run the statistical analysis outside of my Isaac program, and I run it using SPSS. And so that way I'm able to try to run the correct statistic for the job. I can run a variety of statistics rather than just one. And so I think I approach it really much more as a scientist than as just somebody trying to pump out a bunch of analyses. And so I run that analysis, and if I find a statistically significant difference, I will put significance in the significance column, and notice it's highlighted red. If the sample size was appropriate to run the analysis and I found no statistically significant difference, it would say not significant, and it would be highlighted in green. So again, red is bad, green is good. Now notice over in column B then, if I were to find a statistically significant difference, what I do is I go and I highlight each of the pay variables where I found that statistically significant difference. And then I highlight, or I color code them in red. So if you ever see red in the compensation variables, that means there was a statistically significant difference in pay for those variables. But if you see green, which I have below, that basically says, however, I did not find a statistically significant difference for this variable. And one of the reasons that's important is because we're looking at multiple measures of pay, I need to alert you in column H if there's a statistically significant difference, but it's just as important for me to make clear where there was really no statistically significant difference. Now, if the sample size didn't support a statistical analysis, or if the statistic couldn't be computed, then there's no highlighting at all in those variables, and I'll say like not computed in column H. And the last thing I do on this report is I calculate what I call a cohort alert. Now this cohort alert, it takes into account a variety of factors. So for example, it takes into account the size of the difference between the groups. So for example, the size of the difference between males and females. It takes into account the number of problem factors that there are. So in other words, how many of the explanatory factors did the lesser paid group have that was more than the favored group? I also manually, because what I do is I go through, while my system initially sets a preliminary cohort alert level, once I run my statistical analysis, I go back and I look at every single job title and I look at the pattern of those explanatory factors. So here, I would go on this particular case, I would note that females had substantially more time in grade. They had slightly more job performance, although it's probably not that significant, and they had quite a bit more previous experience. And so as a result, taking into account the size of the difference in groups, the fact that females had more time in grade, higher previous experience, a little bit higher job performance, the fact that 3 of the explanatory factors were higher than the favored group, and that there was statistical significance, I set that cohort alert to high and I color code it red. So again, if you were to look at my report, as I'll show you a real one here in a moment, if you see red, that means here is this particular job title is a important candidate for deeper dive and a cohort analysis. So now let's move on to that cohort analysis report. Well, actually, before I do that, let me talk about the cohort analysis. Again, knowing that this is one of those areas that it's time-consuming, it's labor-intensive, I'm trying to find a way to simplify this cohort analysis to the extent that I can. I've actually seen in some companies, it's like people try to run away from the cohort analysis. Nobody wants to own it. Some people think it's the role of the compensation team. Some people think it's the role of the compliance team. There's like, I don't want it. It's like a hot potato that everyone passes around. So I'm trying to simplify it to make it easier for whoever does it. So what I do is for each employee in each job title or pay analysis group, I present their raw data on each of the pay variables or pay drivers and pay drivers. There's nothing unique about this. Every contractor probably does, every consultant and contractor probably does the same thing. Then I calculate the z-scores for each of the pay variables and the explanatory factors so you can see how far any individual is above or below the average on that particular variable. Again, I think probably just about everybody does that. Next, I identify medium or high outliers for the primary pay variable. So, for example, if we have total compensation, I would look at, for each job title, I would look at those employees and I would identify anyone who is an outlier. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And that's probably something that's not all that unique either. Now, one of the things I do is I calculate what are called pay warnings. Now, these pay warnings are very similar to the problem factors that you saw on the compensation analysis tab, and I'll talk about those in just a second. But they really do help to serve identifying whether or not a person's pay is supported by the various data that they have in terms of their explanatory factors. And finally, I have these flags that I call the cohort matcher. And these are flags that you can use or variables that you can set or filters that you can apply that help you identify employees who are similarly situated and who are highly similar on the various pay drivers. So this is what my cohort report looks like. There's more data in this than you can see, and I'll show you that in a minute because I'll use a live view and show you what that looks like. But just off the top, let's take a look at it. Remember, red is bad, yellow is warning, and green is good. And the only exception is the cohort matcher instructions are in green, and it's just because I wanted to set them off. But generally speaking, red, bad, yellow, warning, green is good. So notice that in the job title column, General Auditor 2 is highlighted as red. Now, if you were to go back and look at the compensation analysis summary, what you would see is that the General Auditor 2 job title is red in terms of the cohort warning. And so the point I want to make is that these colors in the job title will correspond to the cohort warning in the compensation analysis tab. And so it's easy to scroll down and quickly find what are those jobs that had the high level of cohort warning, the medium level of cohort warning. The next thing you'll notice in column B is that I identify the gender of each employee. Because this is a gender analysis, notice that that gender variable is in column B and it's not shaded. But notice that in column C, I also provide the ethnic or ethnicity or ethnic grouping of the employee. This is something that has irritated me previously, and I've used previous analytical software that was made by others in previous compensation analyses. And one of the things that always bothered me is that you would run an analysis by gender, but you had no information on the ethnicity of the employees. And then if you ran the analysis by ethnicity, you'd have no information about the gender. And the fact is, you don't want to go tinkering around with pay for females without at least having some knowledge of how that's going to impact your various ethnic groups. So the next thing I want to point out is the outlier. So in column AA, it's under the problem level heading, which is the whole blue section there. The outlier warning, you'll see that it says medium, and then there's a little plus. So I identify two types of outliers, medium outliers and high outliers. A medium outlier is an employee whose pay is more than 1.5 standard deviations above or below the mean. And you can tell it's above or below the mean by the plus or the minus. If there's a plus, it means this employee, their pay is more than 1.5 standard deviations above the mean. If it was a minus, it would tell you that it's more than 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. So if a difference of 1.5 standard deviations isn't statistically significant. However, it's practically significant in the sense that if you know anything about standard deviations, if you have a pay level that's 1.5 standard deviations above the mean, that basically means about 84% of the rest of the employees in that job title make less than you. So you're a fairly high-paid person. I identify high outliers. These are the people whose pay is more than 1.96 standard deviations above or below the mean. And so these are people who are really extremely high or low paid compared to the rest of the people in the job group. As a matter of fact, they earn more than, if you have a high positive outlier, what that's telling you is this person makes more than 98% of the other employees in this particular job group. So notice one of the reasons I have this report the way it is so that you don't have to look at these z-scores, these standard deviations. You just know what this means, and it makes it a lot clearer. Now look in column AB. You'll see that particular column is called a pay warning. Now these pay warnings are very similar to the warning flags that you saw in the compensation analysis summary. Basically, this is a count of, for every outlier, this is a count of how many of the explanatory factors or pay drivers appear not to support that person's high or low pay. And so in other words, it looks at time and grade, and it says, here's a person who is paid, like in this case, it's a medium outlier. This is a person who's paid more than 1.5 standard deviations above the mean. How many of their various explanatory factors are so low that they really don't seem to fall in line with that level of pay? Because ideally what you'd want to see is if someone is an outlier, all of their explanatory factors should also be high. They shouldn't be low. They should be high to support that particularly high pay. Likewise, if someone is a low outlier, you would expect all of their explanatory factors to be somewhat low. In other words, it would support that particular person's pay. And so these pay warnings are essentially it's a little more complicated than that, but they're a count of how many of those explanatory factors didn't appear to support that person's pay. And so the reason I said it's a little more complicated is because, remember, we talk about certain pay drivers. We're considering them more important than others, like time and grade and service years and job performance. So what I do with those is I actually count those twice. So if someone has time and grade that doesn't support their level of pay, I count that twice. So it's like weighting the score if someone's time and grade, service years, or job performance don't support that particular pay. So the way you use that then is you can look at, you can identify outliers super quickly. You can see if they're high or low. You can see their gender or their ethnicity. And you can determine by looking at the pay warning number whether or not their salary appears to be supported. So in this case, we have a Hispanic male who is, their salary is more than 1.5 standard deviations above average, and they have a pay warning score of 7, which means some of their explanatory factors or their pay drivers really don't seem to support that particular level of pay. Now, on the next slide, I have the logic that I use in calculating those pay warnings. So, and how I do it is like this. If you're a negative outlier, either medium or high, if you're an outlier on the negative end and you have any explanatory factors like time and grade, education, performance, anything like that, if any of those are greater than negative 0.75 standard deviations from the mean, in other words, if you have any of those explanatory factors on those high impact variables that are closer to the average, what I do is I increase your pay warning by 2, saying that, wow, here's a high impact factor that supports a higher pay. So I add 2 to my pay warning. But if it's a regular explanatory factor, say education, and if I had determined previously that education isn't one of my high impact drivers, and a person's education seems to be not support their low level of pay, well then they only get increased by 1. So by doing that, essentially I'm really adding weight to those explanatory factors that are significant if they don't seem to support the person's pay. The same thing holds true for outliers, or for positive outliers, except in this case, I'm looking at if you're a high outlier and your time and grade is substantially closer to the mean, then that means that, why are you getting this high pay when your time and grade and your years of service and your job performance is lower, is closer to average? Since it's closer to average, why are you getting this high level of pay? So it's all about helping you to identify significant problems that you should really look at. And the last thing I want to point out is what I call the cohort matcher. Now the cohort matcher What I do with this is I create, for every variable, time and grade, service years, or whatever data I have available, I group people into one of three categories, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And the way I do this, and I have a slide for it, matter of fact, I'm going to pop to the slide now so I can show you. The way I create the cohort matcher is for each z-score on each explanatory factor, such as time and grade, I create these summary flags. So if a person, in terms of time and grade, if compared to everyone else, they're less than 1 standard deviation below average, I give that person and everyone like them a 1. If someone has a z-score on time and grade that is between -1 and 0, so in other words, they're between -1 standard deviation below the mean and the average, I give them a 2. If someone has a time and grade that's between 0 and 1.1 standard deviation above the mean, I give them a 3. And if someone has a time and grade that is more than 1 standard deviation above the mean, I give them a 4. The reason I do this is because when you're trying to identify cohorts, you don't necessarily have to identify people who are absolutely identical, because especially with small sample sizes, there may not be anyone who has an identical z-score or an identical time and grade, things like that. So by using the z-scores to group people, I actually create bigger groups of people that you can select from. So I'm going to go back a slide now. So I'm going to use my cursor here so you can see it. So what you can see here is, for example, for this first female in row 8, she's a general auditor 2. She's female. She's African American. And notice that her time and grade flag for the cohort matcher is 3. Now, because I just went through that logic and I remember this, I can tell you that this person, their time and grade is between the mean, and they're within 1 standard deviation above the mean. And so is the next person. If you go down to the third person, this person has a 4, and this person is a female Asian Pacific Islander. I can tell you by looking at that she is greater than 1 standard deviation above the mean in time and grade. So what you can do with these by selecting filters for time and grade, if you select 3 in a filter, as I'll show you in just a second, what that does is it will grab everybody who has that time and grade. They're not identical, but they're highly similar. In other words, it's a cohort of people who share very similar time and grade. And so you can select additional filters. You can filter down by service years, by job performance. And so you can kind of whittle it down until you can say, all right, here's a group of people who are very similar in time and grade, years of service, education, and job performance. And now you can start comparing why people make more or less pay than each other. And so that's how the cohort matcher works. So let me show you kind of an actual example real quick. Let me look at my time here. I'm running out of time here. Let's see. Okay, so this is an example, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because I really am almost out of time. This is an analysis generated by Isaac, this proprietary tool that I built. And basically, it has a summary analysis where I basically identify the findings for people. But here's the important thing. Now we're looking at an ethnic group analysis. And using the same things we learned for the gender analysis in the PowerPoint presentation, you're looking at this and you see a wall of color. You see greens, you see yellows, you see reds, you see some blue. Once you're used to looking at this, you can instantly see, for General Auditor 2, Hispanics are the favored group. You can instantly see which of the ethnic groups has dramatic differences from the favored group because it's kind of a red hint. So Asian Pacific Islanders have 13.2% less than Hispanics. Whites have 22.7% less. So really quickly I can identify just how big a difference is there between the favored group and the lesser paid groups. African Americans are actually pretty close. They're just 2.78% less. Looking down in column C, you can see that for African Americans, you can see some green, some red, some yellow. The green indicates that on that particular pay variable, African Americans have less than the favored group, which is what you would hope. However, in this case, you can see that African Americans have 33.9 years of service, which is really dramatically more than the favored group, who have 15.1. And notice it's highlighted in red. Why is it highlighted in red? Because it's a high impact pay driver. We determined that when we first began our analysis. African Americans also have 38.8 years of previous experience, which I know is more than whites because it's highlighted in yellow. White, or not whites, but Hispanics. Hispanics have 21.8 years. So enough about that, because it's the same kind of thing we just went over. Now if you look over in column I, you see the problem factors. And again, you can see Hispanics are identified as the favored group. You can see that whites and Pacific Islanders have 2 explanatory factors that are problem factors because they're greater than the favored group. African Americans have 3 problem factors because they're great. They have higher values than the favored group. Again, real quick way to identify whether or not, kind of what's going on here, how big the problem is. You'll notice in column J, I identify that it's statistically significant, and then finally the cohort analysis, or cohort alert, which was based on all that information together, I identify that as a high level of warning. So as you page down, you can see situations where here's investment officer 2, you see all the pattern of stuff. Notice that it's not significant. In the past, whenever we said, oh, there's no statistically significant difference, we often just said, all right, I'm moving on. But what I do is I go and I then look at the pattern of explanatory factors, and even though I didn't find statistical significance, I'm still kind of conducting an eyeball level and intuitive multiple regression analysis, and I look at African Americans and I say, like, all right, there's no statistically significant difference between whites and African Americans. However, African Americans are higher than whites on 3 of the high impact pay drivers and 2 additional of the low impact pay drivers. And so I do kind of a qualitative analysis, and I manually identify the cohort alert as medium. So I like to do this if contractors ask me to. I like to actually go through and do these kinds of real high-level analyses to try to identify problems to save them time on the back end so they don't have to do all this themselves. Really quickly, the cohort analysis. Again, you've got your pay warnings. I can scroll down here. As you scroll down in a cohort analysis, you notice that in job title you don't see any highlighting. Let's see, where am I looking at here? Your pay warnings are here. You've got your medium outliers. I think I have some high outliers in there. You can kind of see those. Oops. See, there's a high outlier. It's plus, so you instantly know that this person is more than 1.96 standard deviations above the mean. So I'm going to show you how the cohort matcher works here. We're going to look at investment officer 2. So what I'm going to do is I can filter by whatever job I want to target. And so now I'm only looking at investment officers. If I want, I can scroll down, and I can see, do I have any outliers? I do have a high outlier there. So here's an outlier that is particularly highly paid, and there are 7 of their explanatory. They have a score of 7, which indicates that they have a certain amount of data that doesn't support that high level of pay. So what I'm going to do is I want to see if I can find a cohort to compare this person to. Notice this person has a 1 in their time and grade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deselect all, and I'm going to select 1, and let's see, there are 2 people. Actually, this is kind of a little bit of an embarrassing thing here. Since this is made-up data, I had to duplicate data to get enough data to make all this stuff make sense. So this is a terrible example. I'm going to skip back here, and I'm going to use a different one. Because there was only one high outlier, and it's a copy. So let's say we're looking at this person here, and I wanted to find a cohort to compare this person to. So I'm going to say, I'm going to look for everybody who has more than one standard deviation above the mean in terms of time and grade. And let's say if I'm looking at this person right here, I'm just going to filter on down. They have a 3 in service years. So now I want to find someone that matches that person in service years. And so you can see what you can ultimately do is you can whittle people down until you've got a smaller grouping of people that now you can start looking at their raw data. And so with that, I'm going to page over. And this is what people typically see when they see my report when they first open it. But watch what happens as I page over. Because I'm using freeze panes, all of the actual raw data for those employees are here. And so you could go back and then you could compare those employees on any of those individual variables. And I really am almost out of time. So I'm going to wrap this up really quickly. So just for benchmark comparison, when I've given this presentation before, I think people have said, wow, that's a lot of information, and it looks very complicated to do. And so I wanted to make sure that I kind of give you an idea, especially if you're a contractor, just how much time this takes. I think the real bulk of the time that goes into this is really the formatting of that Excel table, which is one of the reasons I built my proprietary tool to do a lot of that initial formatting for me so that I can focus primarily on the statistical analysis and then the more subjective analysis to help people identify, job titles that require a cohort analysis. I've timed myself doing this multiple times, and I find that it takes my company about 5 to 6 hours on average, maybe sometimes 7 to do. And so as a result, that should give you kind of a benchmark of how much time it takes. So if you're looking to hire it out, from my perspective, using our billing rates, the typical cost for doing an analysis like that tends to run somewhere between $900 and $1,250 per AAP. So if you're going to hire that particular kind of analysis out, that's just kind of a general benchmark that I might use if I were you. And so with that, just to summarize, item 19 of the scheduling letter, while posing challenges, also presents advantages. The focus on individual ethnic groups may reduce the amount of liabilities and simplify the cohort analysis. There are more appropriate statistical tests than applying t-tests and regression analysis to everything regardless of whether the data meet the assumptions. To run the analysis correctly, you simply can't avoid a customized approach. Automated statistical analyses, they just aren't at the point where they can really ferret out the kinds of things that a good analyst can do. Non-parametric tests, I believe, are generally more appropriate. They give you basically the same results, but not exactly the same results as parametric tests. Statistical analyses, while important, will not answer all the questions, primarily because sample size doesn't often support super high quality results. And since a qualitative analysis is unavoidable, the goal should be to create reports and processes that will facilitate it. And so that basically brings me to the conclusion of this webinar. You see my contact information on the screen. Again, I'm Dr. Jim Higgins. My company is the Higgins Group. You can check us out on the web at www.higginsgrp.com, or feel free to call me at 916-204-1749. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you found this presentation useful, and if you get a chance to drop me a line, if you could let me know, what you thought, I really would very much appreciate it. So thank you very much. Have a terrific day, and hope to see you around on the web sometime.